The temperature inside the torpedo room, 35 degrees Celsius. The humidity, suffocating. And in the compartment directly below, separated by a few centimeters of steel plating, sat 1,080 kilograms of pure oxygen under 225 atmospheres of pressure. One spark, one leak, one moment of carelessness. Lieutenant Takeshi Maeda knew what the Americans called it, the Long Lance, a name spoken with fear and respect. What they didn't know, what Maeda carried in his chest like a stone, was that this weapon had killed more of his own crewmates than it had enemy ships in the last year. His hand rested on the launch lever, and he thought about Ensign Watanabe, incinerated 3 months ago when a Type 93 cooked off during a depth charge attack. They never found enough of him to send home to his mother. In 60 seconds, Maeda would pull this lever and trust that today, this particular torpedo would kill the enemy instead of him. This is the story of the most advanced naval weapon of World War II. But it is really about what happens when revolutionary technology collides with the brutal mathematics of survival, and what it reveals about the terrible bargain at the heart of all military innovation. How much of your own blood are you willing to pay for the enemy's? July 1933, Kure Naval Arsenal, Japan. Captain Kanai Tsuji stood before a weapon that would redefine naval warfare, though he did not yet understand the full price of that revolution. The Type 93 torpedo stretched nearly 9 meters, its polished bronze skin reflecting the harsh overhead lights of the testing facility. On paper, it was perfect. In practice, it would become something far more complicated. A masterpiece of engineering that embodied both Japan's technological ambition and its willingness to sacrifice everything, including the lives of its own sailors, for tactical advantage. To understand what happened, you first need to understand what the Japanese Navy believed in 1933. They believed that a decisive fleet engagement, what they called the Kantai Keisen, would determine the outcome of any Pacific war. They believed that landing the first devastating blow in that battle would guarantee victory. They believed that technological innovation could compensate for industrial inferiority. They believed that Japanese spiritual discipline could overcome any physical danger. The Type 93 torpedo was built on those beliefs, engineered to be the weapon that would shatter American battle lines before American guns could even find their range. It would give Japan's outnumbered fleet the ability to strike first, strike hard, and strike from distances the Americans thought were impossible. The torpedo's design was audacious to the point of recklessness, though that word was never used in official documentation. Where American and British torpedoes used compressed air as their propulsion oxidizer, producing characteristic wake trails that gave away their position and limited their range to perhaps 7,000 meters, the Type 93 used pure oxygen. The implications of this choice cascaded through every aspect of the weapon's performance and every corner of its operational reality. Pure oxygen combustion produced almost no visible wake. The torpedo could streak through the water at 48 knots, invisible until impact, or cruise at 36 knots for an unthinkable 40,000 meters, 40 kilometers. American destroyers couldn't even see that far in combat conditions. The warhead carried 490 kilograms of high explosive, twice what American torpedoes packed. In theory, a single Type 93 hit could cripple a cruiser. 2 hits could break a battleship in half. The Japanese Navy looked at these specifications and saw destiny. What they chose not to see, or perhaps saw and accepted as necessary sacrifice, was the other side of the engineering equation. Pure oxygen under extreme pressure is not merely dangerous. It transforms everything it touches into potential fuel. Metals that seem inert in normal air become explosive. Greases and oils that safely lubricate normal machinery become instantaneous incendiaries. Human sweat contains enough organic compounds to trigger combustion. The men who loaded, maintained, and fired Type 93 torpedoes were working inside what was essentially a contained bomb, kept stable only through procedures so precise that even the smallest deviation could kill everyone in the compartment. The training manuals were thick with warnings, written in the passive bureaucratic language that military institutions use to describe horrible death. Any contamination of the oxygen system may result in spontaneous combustion. Extreme caution must be exercised during all handling procedures. Personnel must be aware of the heightened risk environment. What the manuals did not say, what could not be written in official documentation, was that you could do everything right and still die. That the weapon did not distinguish between procedural error and bad luck, between negligence and the simple chaos of combat at sea. Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Nakamura learned this truth on November 13, 1942, though he did not survive the lesson long enough to pass it on. The heavy cruiser Kinugasa was under air attack south of Guadalcanal, maneuvering hard, taking near misses from bombs that sent shock waves through her hull like hammers striking a bell. Nakamura was in the torpedo room, strapped into position as the ship heeled over in violent evasive turns, when one of those near misses struck close enough to rupture a seal in the oxygen storage system. Not a large rupture, the kind of minor mechanical failure that happens constantly on warships under combat stress, the kind that maintenance crews fix routinely in port. But there was no time for routine maintenance. There was only the hiss of escaping oxygen suddenly enriching the atmosphere of the sealed compartment, and then Nakamura's flashlight, standard equipment, producing a spark that in normal air would have been meaningless. The explosion was so violent that it blew the armored hatch off its hinges. 16 men died instantly, their bodies so completely incinerated that the subsequent investigation could not determine individual identities. The blast ruptured 2 more torpedo oxygen systems, and those weapons detonated in sequence, blowing a hole in Kinugasa's hull large enough to drive a truck through. The ship capsized and sank in 8 minutes. 511 men went into the water. 237 were recovered. The official report listed the cause as enemy bomb damage. Technically true. Practically, a comfortable lie that avoided asking uncomfortable questions about whether a weapon that could destroy its own ship from the inside was worth the tactical advantage it provided. Think about what this meant for the men who worked with Type 93 torpedoes every single day, not in one moment of crisis, but across months and years of naval operations, knowing that their workspace was a pressurized bomb that they had to maintain while their ship maneuvered violently, while depth charges exploded nearby, sending shock waves through the hull, while fires burned and damage control teams ran through passageways and chaos reigned, and the only thing keeping them alive was a series of seals and valves and procedures that had to work perfectly, every single time, forever. There is a particular kind of stress that comes from working with something that can kill you faster than you can comprehend your own death. Not the adrenaline fear of combat, which at least gives you something to fight or flee from, but the cold mathematical certainty that your survival depends on factors beyond your control. You can be perfect and still die. The weapon does not care about your skill or your dedication or how carefully you followed procedures. It only cares about the laws of physics and chemistry, and those laws are unforgiving. By late 1942, after a year of intense combat operations, the statistical reality was becoming impossible to ignore. Of the 63 documented cases of catastrophic Type 93 failures, 41 occurred not during enemy action, but during routine operations or immediately after minor damage. Torpedo rooms were becoming death traps, triggered by events that had nothing to do with the torpedo itself. A depth charge explosion 100 meters away could create sufficient shockwave to compromise oxygen system integrity. Saltwater corrosion, inevitable on ships that spent months at sea, could degrade seals below safe tolerances. Even the heat of tropical operations caused expansion in the oxygen tanks that put additional stress on containment systems designed with temperate water assumptions. The men who maintained these weapons developed an unofficial set of supplementary procedures, passed down through whispered conversations and demonstrated by example, tricks and techniques that the official manuals never mentioned, because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging that the official procedures were insufficient. They learned to listen for the specific tone of oxygen hissing under pressure, a sound that meant you had perhaps 30 seconds to evacuate before the compartment became a crematorium. They learned to watch for the particular way condensation formed on oxygen lines when internal pressure was climbing toward dangerous levels. They learned never to work alone because if something went wrong, you wanted someone outside the blast radius who could at least tell your family what happened. Lieutenant Maida, standing at his launch station in 1944, carried all of this knowledge like scar tissue. He had survived 3 catastrophic oxygen fires. He had pulled burned men from wreckage and held them while they died because there was nothing else to do. He had written letters to families explaining that their sons died serving the Emperor, omitting the detail that they were killed by their own weapons while the enemy was nowhere in sight. And he was still here, still pulling the launch lever, because the alternative was refusing to use the most effective weapon in Japan's arsenal. This is the arithmetic of military necessity. Men are expendable, tactical advantage is not. The Type 93 could reach out and kill American ships from distances that made conventional naval warfare obsolete. That capability was worth any price in Japanese blood, and the price was extracted with mechanical efficiency, one oxygen fire at a time. The Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30, 1942, showed both sides of this terrible equation with perfect clarity. 8 Japanese destroyers, loaded with supplies for Guadalcanal, encountered 5 American cruisers and 7 destroyers in Iron Bottom Sound. The Americans had every advantage: superior radar, surprise, overwhelming firepower. The Japanese had Type 93 torpedoes. What happened next became a case study in how tactical brilliance and catastrophic design flaws could coexist in the same weapon system. The Japanese destroyers launched their torpedoes from 12,000 meters, far beyond the range where American commanders thought torpedo attack was even possible. The long lances ran silent and invisible through the dark water, their pure oxygen propulsion leaving no wake for American lookouts to spot. The first impacts came without warning. The heavy cruiser Minneapolis took 2 torpedoes that blew off her entire bow. Flagship New Orleans took a hit that detonated her forward magazines, the explosion so violent it severed the front third of the ship. Pensacola took a torpedo that opened her engineering spaces to the sea. Northampton took 2 hits and sank. 4 heavy cruisers crippled or sunk in the span of 8 minutes, without the Japanese destroyers suffering a single hit in return. It was the kind of one-sided victory that Japanese naval doctrine had been built to achieve, proof that the Type 93 could deliver exactly the devastating first strike that would decide fleet engagements. But there was another story unfolding simultaneously on the Japanese destroyers, one that did not make it into the official battle reports. On the destroyer Takanami, a near miss from American gunfire ruptured a steam line that ran adjacent to the torpedo room. Superheated steam began filling the compartment, raising the temperature and creating thermal stress on the oxygen storage tanks. Petty Officer Yamamoto, the senior torpedo technician, recognized what was happening and ordered an emergency purge of the oxygen systems, a procedure that would render the remaining torpedoes unusable but might prevent a catastrophic explosion. He had 15 seconds to make that decision. If he purged the system and the containment held, he would be eliminating the ship's primary weapons for no reason. If he did not purge the system and the containment failed, everyone in the torpedo room would die and possibly take the entire ship with them. He chose to purge. The oxygen vented into the sea in a massive plume of bubbles that compromised the destroyer's stealth but saved the lives of everyone aboard. Takanami withdrew from the battle with half her torpedo armament deliberately disabled by her own crew to prevent it from destroying the ship. The American battle damage report noted the destroyer's unusual bubble trail, but could not explain it. The Japanese battle report omitted the incident entirely because acknowledging it would require admitting that the Type 93 was as dangerous to its operators as it was to the enemy. This is where we need to slow down and understand something about institutional psychology, about how military organizations process information that contradicts their foundational assumptions. The Imperial Japanese Navy had invested enormous resources and national prestige into the Type 93 program. The weapon was central to their doctrine, their tactics, their entire theory of how they would fight and win the decisive battle. Admitting that it was systematically killing their own crews would require confronting a series of questions that had no good answers. If the weapon is too dangerous to use safely, why did we build it? If we knew it was dangerous but built it anyway, what does that say about how much we value the lives of our sailors? If the tactical advantage is worth the casualties, how do we explain that to the families of men who died in peacetime accidents? If we acknowledge the danger publicly, will crews refuse to work with the weapon? And if they refuse, how do we maintain our tactical doctrine? The institutional response to these questions was denial, not because the evidence was insufficient, but because accepting the evidence would undermine the entire strategic framework of the Japanese Navy. So reports of oxygen fires were filed under combat damage even when they occurred during training exercises. Casualties were attributed to enemy action even when no enemy was present. Design modifications that might have reduced the danger were shelved because they would also reduce the weapon's performance, and performance was the metric that mattered. Meanwhile, the men who actually worked with the torpedoes developed their own parallel understanding of reality, one that existed in the gap between official doctrine and lived experience. They knew, with a certainty born from watching friends die, that the Type 93 was as much enemy as weapon. They developed dark humor about it, the kind of gallows jokes that soldiers always create when facing random death. They called the oxygen bottles suicide tanks. They referred to torpedo room duty as volunteering for cremation. They made bets about which ship would suffer the next catastrophic fire, not in a spirit of entertainment, but as a psychological defense mechanism, a way to maintain some illusion of control over forces that were fundamentally uncontrollable. And they kept working because military discipline demanded it, because national honor required it, because admitting their fear would be shameful, and because somewhere in the complicated calculus of duty and survival, they had accepted that their lives were currency to be spent in pursuit of victory. By 1944, the tactical situation had evolved in ways that made the Type 93's dangers even more acute. American ships now had radar that could detect surface targets long before visual contact, negating some of the torpedo's stealth advantage. American anti-submarine warfare had improved dramatically, meaning Japanese submarines carrying Type 93 torpedoes faced depth charging that put enormous stress on oxygen containment systems. And American industrial production was flooding the Pacific with ships faster than Japan could sink them, meaning the decisive battle the Type 93 was designed for would never actually happen. The war had become attritional, and in attritional warfare, a weapon that kills its own crews is a strategic liability regardless of how effective it is against the enemy. But by 1944, there was no alternative. Japan had built its entire naval strategy around the Type 93. Every destroyer, every cruiser, every submarine had been designed with these weapons in mind. The training programs, the tactical doctrine, the ammunition supply chains, everything was optimized for the long lance. Abandoning it would mean abandoning the Navy's ability to fight at range, and range was the only advantage Japan still possessed, against an enemy with more ships, more planes, more resources, and increasingly better technology. So Lieutenant Maeda stood at his launch station in 1944, his hand on a lever connected to a weapon that represented the best and worst of Japanese military engineering. The Type 93 could reach out and kill from impossible distances. It could turn a single destroyer into a battleship killer. It gave Japan's outnumbered fleet a way to punch far above its weight class. And it killed Japanese sailors with mechanical regularity, not through enemy action, but through the inherent instability of its own design. He pulled the lever. The torpedo ejected from its tube with a blast of compressed air, its engine igniting as it hit the water, pure oxygen mixing with kerosene in a controlled burn that produced enormous thrust and almost no visible trace. Somewhere across the dark water, an American ship was about to have a very bad day. And in the torpedo room, men were already preparing the next weapon, working with the careful precision of people defusing a bomb, because that is effectively what they were doing. The final accounting of the Type 93's casualties is difficult to establish with precision because the Japanese Navy's record-keeping degraded severely in the war's final years, and because many ships were simply lost with all hands, making it impossible to determine whether they were sunk by enemy action or destroyed by their own weapons cooking off under battle damage. But the pattern is clear enough in the surviving documentation. The heavy cruiser Suzuya, torpedoed by American aircraft in October 1944, might have survived that damage if her own Type 93 torpedoes had not exploded in sequence, turning manageable flooding into catastrophic structural failure. The destroyer Nowaki, depth-charged in October 1944, sank so quickly that investigators believe her oxygen systems ruptured and ignited, eliminating any chance of damage control. The light cruiser Tama, torpedoed by an American submarine, was being abandoned in reasonably good order when her torpedo room exploded, killing dozens of men who had survived the initial attack. How many ships were lost this way? The honest answer is that we will never know. The documented cases number in the dozens, the suspected cases number in the hundreds, and the psychological toll on the men who survived to continue working with these weapons cannot be measured at all. Consider the position of Warrant Officer Kenji Sato, senior torpedo technician on the destroyer Yukikaze, the only Japanese destroyer to survive the entire war without catastrophic damage. Sato maintained and launched Type 93 torpedoes through 4 years of continuous combat operations, from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines to the final desperate runs to Okinawa. He watched other ships explode from internal torpedo fires. He survived depth charge attacks that by all logic should have triggered his own oxygen systems. He performed maintenance on weapons that could incinerate him faster than his nervous system could register pain, and he did this day after day, month after month, year after year, because the alternative was abandoning his post, and that was simply not conceivable. In his private journal, recovered after the war, he described the experience in terms that have nothing to do with technical specifications or tactical effectiveness. He wrote about the weight of walking into the torpedo room each morning, knowing that today might be the day the mathematics caught up with him. He wrote about the specific quality of silence that fell over the compartment during oxygen system maintenance, every man holding his breath, listening for the hiss that would be the last sound they heard. He wrote about the dreams, the ones where he was trapped in the torpedo room while oxygen leaked and he could not find the source, could not stop it, could only wait for the ignition that never came in the dream, but that his subconscious knew was inevitable. This is the part of the story where we need to confront what the Type 93 reveals about the nature of military innovation and the price of tactical advantage. The weapon worked exactly as designed. It gave Japan's Navy the ability to strike first and strike devastatingly from ranges the enemy thought were impossible. In the hands of well-trained crews operating under ideal conditions, it was the most effective torpedo in the world, and the battles where it performed as intended were stunning demonstrations of what technological superiority could achieve. But weapons are not operated under ideal conditions. They are operated by exhausted men on damaged ships under enemy fire in the chaos of combat, where perfect procedures become impossible and where minor failures cascade into catastrophic consequences. The Type 93's design philosophy assumed perfect execution in an imperfect world, and the gap between that assumption and reality was filled with the bodies of Japanese sailors who were killed by their own weapons while trying to use them as intended. Was it worth it? That question has no objective answer. From a purely tactical perspective, the Type 93 gave Japan capabilities they could not have achieved any other way, and those capabilities produced victories that would have been impossible with conventional weapons. From a strategic perspective, those victories were not enough to change the war's outcome, and the ships and men lost to internal torpedo fires might have been more valuable if preserved for the attritional struggle the war actually became. From a human perspective, from the perspective of the men who worked with these weapons every day, the question is almost obscene. Worth it to whom? The sailors who died in training accidents? The crews who survived but carried the psychological weight of knowing they could die at any moment from their own arsenal? The families who received letters explaining their sons died serving the emperor without mentioning they were killed by weapons that should never have been loaded on a ship? The Allied intelligence assessment of the Type 93, compiled in 1945 after the war ended and captured Japanese documentation became available, is remarkable for its clinical acknowledgement of the weapon's dual nature. The report praised the torpedo's technical sophistication and tactical effectiveness. It noted that American naval tactics had to be completely revised once the Long Lance's capabilities were understood. It recommended that similar oxygen propulsion systems be investigated for American use. And then, in a footnote that almost seems like an afterthought, it mentioned the catastrophic failure rate and suggested that the safety issues would need to be resolved before any such weapon could be deployed on American ships. That footnote represents a fundamental difference in how the two navies valued their personnel. The United States had the industrial capacity to pursue both performance and safety, to develop weapons that were effective without being suicidal to operate. Japan did not have that luxury. They had to choose between tactical effectiveness and operator safety, and they chose effectiveness because they believed, correctly or not, that their survival as a nation depended on it. The men who paid the price for that choice were never asked their opinion. They were simply expected to do their duty, to master a weapon that was trying to kill them, and to die, if necessary, in service of a strategic doctrine that treated their lives as acceptable losses in pursuit of tactical advantage. Lieutenant Maeda survived the war. His ship, the destroyer Shigure, was one of the few to make it through to surrender in 1945. In interviews conducted decades later, he spoke about the Type 93 with a complicated mixture of pride and anger that never fully resolved into a single coherent narrative. He was proud of his technical skill, of his ability to work with one of the most sophisticated weapons ever deployed at sea. He was proud of the battles where the Long Lance had turned certain defeat into stunning victory, and he was angry, deeply angry, at a system that had placed him and thousands of others in a position where doing their jobs meant accepting random death as a routine workplace hazard. He described standing at his launch station, hand on the firing lever, thinking about Ensign Watanabe and all the others who had died in torpedo room fires, and realizing that he had been angry this entire time. Not at the Americans, who were simply the enemy, and that was understandable, but at his own commanders, who had known from the beginning that the weapon was dangerous, who had accepted those casualties as necessary, and who had never once asked the men who actually worked with the torpedoes whether the tactical advantage was worth the price in blood. The Type 93 torpedo was retired from service in 1945, along with the rest of Imperial Japanese Navy's arsenal. No Navy ever adopted pure oxygen propulsion for torpedoes on the same scale, despite the obvious performance advantages. The British experimented with it. The Soviets built a few prototypes. The Americans evaluated the captured Japanese systems extensively, and all of them reached the same conclusion. The safety issues were not worth the performance gains, not when conventional propulsion could be refined to close most of the capability gap without turning every torpedo room into a potential bomb. Modern torpedoes use carefully balanced chemical, propellants, electric propulsion, or other systems that prioritize reliability and safety alongside performance. The idea of putting 1,080 kilograms of pure oxygen under extreme pressure inside a warship, surrounded by men and machinery and all the chaos of naval operations, is now understood as fundamentally unsound engineering, a case study in what happens when tactical requirements are allowed to override basic safety considerations. But that understanding came too late for the men who died in torpedo room fires between 1933 and 1945. They were pioneers in a field where pioneering meant dying in novel ways so that future generations could learn what not to do. Their deaths proved that some technological advances are not worth pursuing, that some tactical advantages cost more than they provide, and that weapons which kill their own operators are failures regardless of how effective they are against the enemy. The memorial at Kure Naval Arsenal, where the Type 93 was developed and refined over 12 years of continuous improvement, contains the names of 1,143 men confirmed killed in torpedo-related accidents between 1933 and 1945. That number does not include combat casualties where Type 93 failures contributed to ship losses. It does not include the men who died on ships that sank with all hands, where cause of death could not be established. It does not include the men who were permanently disabled by oxygen fires but survived, or the men who developed chronic health problems from prolonged exposure to high oxygen environments, or the men who suffered psychological trauma from working with the weapons and never received treatment because that kind of injury was not recognized as legitimate. The true cost of the Long Lance will never be fully calculated because the Imperial Japanese Navy did not consider those costs worth tracking. They tracked performance metrics, kill ratios, tactical effectiveness. They did not track how many of their own sailors they killed in pursuit of those metrics, because asking that question would require confronting uncomfortable truths about what they were willing to sacrifice for victory. Think about Petty Officer Yamamoto, who made the decision to purge his oxygen systems during the Battle of Tassafaronga, rendering his torpedoes useless but saving his crew. His decision was not recognized in any official capacity. There was no commendation for choosing life over tactical effectiveness, because acknowledging that such a choice was necessary would mean acknowledging that the weapon forced impossible decisions on its operators. But in the unofficial network of torpedo technicians spread across the fleet, Yamamoto's decision became legendary. It was whispered about in torpedo rooms, passed down through the oral tradition that exists in every military beneath the official doctrine, held up as an example of the kind of judgment call that senior technicians might have to make. Save the ship or use the weapon. Save your crew or follow procedure. Live with the shame of choosing safety over duty or die having done everything right. These were not choices that should ever have been necessary. They were the product of a weapon system that had never fully resolved the contradiction between its tactical brilliance and its operational impossibility. The final judgment on the Type 93 Long Lance must account for both its stunning tactical successes and its systematic slaughter of the men who operated it. It must acknowledge that this was the most sophisticated torpedo of its era, a weapon that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible and that gave Japan's outnumbered fleet capabilities that changed how naval warfare was conducted. And it must also acknowledge that this sophistication was built on a foundation of acceptable casualties. that the weapon's effectiveness was purchased with the blood of sailors who were killed by their own arsenal, at rates that would have been unacceptable in any other military organization with other options. The long lance was not a failure. It was something more complicated and more disturbing. A successful weapon that succeeded by treating its operators as expendable components in a system optimized for tactical effectiveness above all other considerations. It worked exactly as intended, and the cost of that intended function was measured in cremated bodies, psychological trauma, and the slow institutional acceptance that some prices are too high even for victory. Japan lost the war. The decisive fleet battle, the Type 93, was designed for never materialized in the way Japanese doctrine predicted. The weapon that was supposed to deliver victory instead delivered tactical successes that did not translate into strategic advantage, while steadily eroding Japan's pool of experienced torpedo technicians through a combination of combat losses and accidents that were really the same thing viewed from different angles. In the end, the Type 93 killed plenty of Americans. It also killed plenty of Japanese. And the question of whether the former was worth the latter depends entirely on who you ask and whether you value tactical innovation over the lives of the men who must operate it. Lieutenant Maida, standing at his post in 1945 as his ship prepared to surrender, knew his answer. He had pulled that lever knowing it might kill him for 4 years. He had survived when so many others had not, through some combination of skill and luck that he could never quite sort out. And when the war ended and the torpedoes were finally removed from their tubes and disposed of, when the oxygen tanks were vented and the systems were purged one last time, he felt something that took him years to recognize as relief. Not that the war was over, not that Japan had lost, but that he would never again have to trust his life to a weapon that was as likely to kill him as save him. That finally the mathematics had run out before he did.